So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. There are still a couple of seats in the front. If people want seats, there's also one that you can move from over there. So please filter on in. I'm sorry. I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad it's full. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm a professor of political studies, philosophy, and human rights here at Bard College, and also the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center. And along with my colleagues in the Human Rights Project and the Jewish Studies Program, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this program on critical perspectives on the war in the Middle East. I'm not going to introduce everyone. I just want to welcome you. I'll introduce our moderator today, Elmira Bayrosli. She's the author of From the Other Side of the World, Extraordinary Entrepreneurs, Unlikely Places. She's also the director of the Bard Globalization International Affairs program in New York. And she runs a newsletter called Interrupter with 2 R's at the end that you can look for and find. So I'll let Elmira get us going. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited and enjoy this event. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Roger. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Wonderful. Welcome. It's my pleasure to be here with Ghaith, Al-Omari, and Fred Hof, and I'll briefly introduce them. But this is interesting. Ghaith and Fred sat across from each other in 2000 and 2001 as negotiators trying to agree on a common account of how the Second Intifada began. And so we're here as we see what is happening today between Israel and Gaza, to see if there's a way that they, to discuss if there's a basis for common understanding or common ground. Ghaith Al-Omari is the Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S. Israel Strategic Relationship. He was on the negotiating team, not only on the commission for the fact-finding mission on the Sharm el-Sheikh fact-finding commission, but also on the Palestinian negotiating team. And Fred Hof is a former U.S. Army officer and diplomat specializing in the Middle East. He is now Bard's diplomat in residence. Okay, well, with that, I'd love to hear a little bit about, it was interesting preparing for this. I mean, I like to think of myself as somebody who dives in and reads everything, but it's the first time that I read the Sharm el-Sheikh fact-finding report, which came out in April 2001. And for those of you who have not read it, and I'm hoping that I wasn't the only one who hasn't read it. It's very clearly laid out, but I'd love to, maybe we can start with how did each of you come to be a part of the committee? But Ghaith, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Before I answer your question, Bjorn, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here, and doubly so to be with Fred. And thank you all for being here. I mean, I think today we'll be focusing a lot on the kind of diplomacy of what is of this conflict, past and present, and hopefully future. Yet it's always important to remember that as we talk about diplomatic issues, this is also issues that affect real people's lives. Anyone here who has any connection to Israel, I'm sure it's very hard. It's still dealing with the outcomes of the terror attacks on October 7th. And anyone who has connection with Palestine and the Palestinians is also dealing today with the heartbreaking images that we are seeing from Gaza. So if you don't start building your analytical thinking based on some degree of understanding the human dimension of this conflict, I think diplomacy will always be missing. Now, to your question, how I got to it. I was a member of the Palestinian negotiating team. I joined the negotiating team in '98. We were, before the Intifada broke out, that's the conflict that started in the year 2000. We were part of this negotiation process. We were in Camp David, we were elsewhere. We thought we were actually resolved the Palestinian-Israeli problem. The negotiations broke down, the violence started, the conflict started, and we were pushing. Sorry, my phone's doing weird stuff. We were basically trying to, we had our own understanding on the Palestinian side of what the conflict was. Obviously, the Israelis had their own understanding, and we were pushing for basically validation in the international community of our own narrative to start with, but also hoping to achieve certain diplomatic results. Long story short, there was a meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, that's an Egyptian city, and out of that meeting, a decision was made to create a fact-finding commission composed of American, actually a former Turkish president, Demirel, and a number of others. And we were building a team on the Palestinian side. Part of the team obviously was political. They needed the lawyers and diplomats, and this is where I came in. So we were basically the operational working level dealing with this, and we were both pushing, in a sense, what our political masters were asking us to push, but also we were doing it as professional diplomats. And there was sometimes tension between these two missions, but this is how I got involved in this.
You may remember from relatively recent history that in July 2000.
Fred, can you use the mic? Hold up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
close. Yeah.
That better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. July 2000, there was a summit meeting at Camp David that was called by President Clinton. It was really inspired more than anybody else by Ehud Barak, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time. The key players were Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Barak. They were there at Camp David for the better part of 2 weeks. They discussed most of the issues that would have to be resolved for a two-state solution to emerge, but they were unable at the end of the day to come to an agreement during those 2 weeks. Then something happened, the likes of which I have never seen elsewhere in the world of diplomacy. Instead of saying, we touched all the third rail issues, nobody got electrocuted. Let's take a break. Let's let the senior staff work on this and then we can reconvene. This is obviously what should have been done. What was done instead was that President Clinton and Prime Minister Barak decided to blame Yasser Arafat for the whole thing. And this set in motion a very contentious atmosphere with Barak saying, I don't have a partner for peace. I basically wasted my time here. We had an incident in September where Ariel Sharon, in what was really an act of Israeli political theater more than anything else, took a very controversial walk on the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, the most sacred place in Jerusalem.
When he did that, sorry, I want to ask, when Sharon went to the Temple Mount, had Barak resigned? Oh, no, or he had called for a vote of no confidence?
No, Barak was still the prime
Okay.
minister. There would not be elections until February
Okay.
2001. And Barak basically gave Sharon permission to do this. Sharon's purpose, as I said, this was a piece of Israeli political theater. Sharon's purpose was to steal a march on Bibi Netanyahu, who was Sharon's opponent to lead the Likud party in the upcoming elections. All right, there was violence took place. Israeli police used deadly force. There were rocks tossed down toward the Wailing Wall where there were the Jewish people worshiping, and things were off and running from there, the second intifada. As Ghaith mentions, there was a summit meeting a couple of weeks later in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt to try to put things back into the box. Yasser Arafat at the meeting suggested that there be a fact-finding committee to figure out why this violence started and what would have to be done to get it back under control. You may remember, well, from history anyway, for most people in this room, in 2000 there was a disputed election in the United States. George Bush and Al Gore. Supreme Court decided the election, Bush v. Gore. The day after that decision, I got a call. I was minding my own business. I was in the private sector in an international consulting firm. I got a call from the chief of staff of something called the Sharm el-Sheikh Fact-Finding Committee saying, Fred, how about joining us? We need somebody to write the report that we're eventually going to write, but what we need in the meantime is someone who can help convince the incoming Bush administration not to kill a fact-finding committee that had been created by Bill Clinton. The senior partner in the firm I was working, a fellow named Richard Armitage, was known to be a likely senior official in the incoming Bush administration. He turned out to be Colin Powell's Deputy Secretary of State. So that's basically how I got involved, on the expectation that I could be sort of a back channel to Armitage and Colin Powell to keep this thing alive when the Bush administration would come to power on January 20th, 2001.
Okay.
That part at least worked.
Okay, so there's the dynamic of the Camp David talks had broken down. The second intifada broke out. There was this attempt at Sharm el-Sheikh to try to restart the process. Arafat says, let's do the fact-finding commission, and then you're all convened to, and then there's this element of there's a new U.S. administration coming in. Can you just talk maybe, it's interesting because, I mean, obviously hindsight is 2020, but at this moment, and I do remember this moment, I mean, it seemed that things were going down a bad road, right? It seemed that, you know, there was almost, I mean, when you have from the Oslo in 1993, am I correct in that? All the way through the Camp David talks in July of 2000, it seemed that there was going to be significant progress, and there was this moment where it seemed so close, but then it really unraveled. How was it when you first came to do the fact-finding mission, and what were the dynamics there? Because I want to also then talk about what is happening today, and how that compares to what you experienced then.
You know, I mean, maybe I'll start by just reiterating a point that Fred mentioned, because I think it's relevant to that and what's happening now, which is the issue of the role of framing in diplomacy. I mean, you talked about Camp David. Camp David could have been framed as a failure, as it was framed, as you described. Could have been framed as a success. Camp David was the first time that we actually started seriously talking about, I was there, so I saw it firsthand, talking about difficult issues like Jerusalem, the future of Jerusalem, the first time the Israelis were discussing the idea of dividing Jerusalem. We're talking about the first time we discussed the idea of a demilitarized Palestinian state and some of the other issues. It could have been framed in a different way. However, I mean, I think, you know, and that's relevant to your question now, while we made tremendous progress, not only in Camp David, but throughout the period, I mean, up to a point where we actually got to more or less agreement on the overall contours of what a solution would look like, something that Clinton later on that year would actually articulate in what's called the Clinton parameters. The framing in all of this time was a framing of basically saying it's failed and it's blaming the other side. I think both Palestinians and Israelis were feeling, the political leaders were feeling beleaguered by their oppositions, and they wanted to present a tough stance. This created a degree of tension among both societies. We already had started to see a narrative of failure, a narrative of there's no partner on the other side. And there was pent-up energy, pent-up anger that ultimately, you know, was triggered and what became the second intifada. And there were actors out there who had an interest in actually exploding the situation. I can speak about the Palestinian side. On our side, Hamas, which was never interested and was never for a diplomatic solution, you know, throughout the 90s, every time we make progress, they would blow up a bus here or a cafe there. And that was a moment where they felt that the tension was so high that it was the right time to explode things, and the publics were actually responsive to this. Now, in the beginning of the second intifada, things were actually still manageable. I mean, we have not gotten to the level of violence that later on started characterizing the second intifada, whether it would come from the terror on the Palestinian side, or the excessive use of force on the Israeli side. So when Fred and his team came in, there was still a sense that we can salvage things. There was still things that, we were not, I guess, aware at that time of the depth of what was to come. We always thought of the beginning of the Second Intifada as simply another round of violence, and there have been previous rounds of violence, and we felt that a diplomatic process could kind of take us out of that. In retrospect, of course, things by that time I think had reached a point where it was beyond control, and unfortunately that the dynamic on the ground had to take its own course until diplomacy became relevant again.
Yeah, I think by the time we started our work at the beginning of 2001 in Jerusalem, Israelis and Palestinians had already come quite a distance in losing faith and confidence in one another. The initial optimism that had been generated by Oslo lasted, I guess, between two and 3 years. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was a major factor. But even before that, you had this dynamic of settlement expansion, which never slowed down one bit post-Oslo, and violence, mainly Hamas violence. And it was this dynamic that was wearing away mutual confidence. And of course, you had the arrival of Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, a person who was fundamentally opposed to the Oslo process, and had to be dragged, kicking and screaming, by President Clinton into a couple of follow-up agreements to try to keep the process moving. But our mission basically is on the fact-finding committee, try to find out why this violence started, what needs to be done to stop it, how to get the parties back to negotiations. That was our mission.
Right, and the report says, I mean, it's as you said, it was end the violence, rebuild confidence, resume negotiations, and you touched on the settlements. I do have one question though, Fred, in terms of the Americans. I think the Clinton administration really thought that they were on the verge of getting a final peace agreement. Why didn't they press the Israelis on the settlements?
Excellent question. What President Clinton did not do at Camp David was he did not put on the table an American proposal for settling all this, including the settlement issue. Okay? He later did the so-called Clinton parameters at almost the very last minute of the Clinton administration. And he even undermined that by having a quiet conversation with the incoming president-elect, George W. Bush, telling Bush, hey, if you want my advice, don't waste any time on the Middle East. I've spent a lot of quality time on this and gotten nowhere with Israelis and Palestinians. But the settlement issue was key, and this is what the report looks like. I was the main author, but the person who insisted on writing the section on settlements was the former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell. He felt very strongly about this. He spoke with former Secretary of State Jim Baker, a Republican. He spoke with a lot of people. And Mitchell was absolutely convinced that no progress was going to be made unless there was a settlement freeze, and perhaps and certainly the rollback of settlements that even according to Israeli law were illegal.
You know, I mean, a friendly amendment and maybe an addition. The friendly amendment is actually in Camp David, and there I think 2 or 3, the Americans put a proposal on the table. However, we threw a hissy fit, the Israelis threatened to leave, and the Americans got cold feet, and within less than 24 hours, they withdrew the proposal. And that is worse than actually not putting a proposal to start with. When you're a mediator, when you are, especially when you're a superpower with the United States, you do not show that degree of deference to the sides. And I think in many ways, you know, to your question, why didn't Clinton, even before Camp David, push on these issues? And by the way, he also did not push us on taking our security responsibilities seriously. And the fact is, he was, you know, I mean, his calculus, and I sympathize with it at some level, was these are 2 leaders, Arafat and the Israeli leaders, especially during the times of Rabin, who are taking a risk, and basically they know their politics best, and I should not push them. And that differential thing actually basically did not create a counterweight to the pressure that these people, leaders were feeling from the rejectionists. I mean, if I look back at it, I think had Clinton pushed the Israelis on settlements, pushed us on security, we could have gone back to our own publics and say, okay, you guys on our opposition are pushing us, but we have the President of the United States pushing us in the other direction. Instead, he basically removed the guardrails, as it were, and we all felt, we on the Palestinians and the Israelis, being pushed by our oppositions and veering more and more towards negative behavior. So that's, to me, again, another lesson learned. If you're a mediator, you have to be tough, and sometimes you have to provide the counter weight to those who are rejectionists, which will always exist in both camps.
Yeah, it was quite a contrast to Jimmy Carter in 1978 at Camp David. Jimmy Carter, a guy who, you know, to whom history has not been particularly kind. But he spent 2 weeks at Camp David banging heads together and putting an American proposal on the table that was eventually adopted.
So the fact-finding commission ends, the report comes out. How are your views about what is happening either with the peace process? How is that impacted?
Yeah, you know, first of all, the report was well received by both sides, by Israelis and Palestinians. They at least there were things they disagreed with in our conclusions and our recommendations, but they at least gave us credit for baseline integrity in putting this together. Now, when the report was finished, Senator Mitchell, former Senator Mitchell, delivered it first to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. And his words to Powell were, Colin, one thing you got to remember, this report is not going to implement itself. The United States, you've got to be prepared to start banging heads together right away, working with both sides on timing and sequencing of recommendation implementation. And Powell said, well, I understand, George, and by the way, the president would like to see you. So Mitchell went in to see, the next day, went in to see President Bush in the Oval Office. And Bush was very cordial. He said, among other things, he said, George, don't be too quick to retire your uniform here. You know, the implication being that Mitchell might be called back to start to implement this report. But Mitchell said the same. He said, Mr. President, please, please, please keep in mind, this report is not going to implement itself. And sure enough, the administration was not prepared to implement. I know the Office of Vice President Cheney was not very friendly toward the fact-finding committee in any event. But you know, several weeks went by, nothing was happening, and then the violence began to pick up again. And after that, you had a series of people you know, like volunteer firemen sent in by the administration to try to stop the violence. George Tenet, General Tony Zinni, people like this, you know, coming in and begging for a ceasefire, but it was too late. So you know, the Bush administration's lack of preparedness to get to work on this turned out to be fatal.
You know, I mean, I'm going to approach this from a very different angle. And I would say, for me at least, reading this report was very humbling. And let me take a step back. I mean, we're used, if you're a Palestinian diplomat, you're very used to basically getting critical reports and reports you don't agree with, and you just dismiss them. Because you always say, oh, the authors are so anti-Palestinian, so biased, blah, 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 I'm not going to take it seriously. This was different. This was different because, I mean, first and foremost, I think Senator Mitchell himself, who is such a man of great integrity and great empathy. And then the team, and you know, Fred and others were such kind of, you know, truly people who we felt were genuine. And then, you know, you take it seriously. Then you read the report. And now, you know, when you're a negotiator, when you're someone who see yourself as part of a camp, you're very invested in your own narrative, you're very invested in your own view of things, and you're very invested in your outcomes. Then you will see you come and read a report from a team that you actually cannot dismiss, you cannot discredit. And the report really actually doesn't completely fit our narrative. I mean, you know, as I said, we received it well, yet there were many parts of it that we disagreed with. Not only the recommendations, even the description of what happened. We had our own narrative of why things started, and we were so invested in it. And that, to my mind, to me, that actually created a need to do a degree of soul searching that we are not used to as diplomats. As diplomats, you're so used to basically, you know, you're a lawyer. You're a lawyer, your job is to basically take your client's interest and push it and win the case. When you start reading something like this, you have to start asking yourself, wait on, maybe the other side has a point. Maybe I should be more open and more accepting. To my mind, yes, in the end, you know, reality trumped, as it were, diplomacy, and it created its own dynamic. But I think this was one of the moments, and it's not only me. I know some of my more senior bosses, some of my team members, we're always like, wow, you know, there's something that we have to go and look back at. And by the way, this is a moment, for example, where the current president, Mahmoud Abbas, who was, you know, I have many criticisms of him, and I'm sure this is going to come out, but he's someone who's against violence. And this was the moment, I think, with the Sharm el-Sheikh, with the report, that he basically started confronting Arafat and saying, we have to do our bit in stopping the violence because it's not good for us. So there is a value when you have a trusted third party who will come and not only kind of tell you what you want to hear, but kind of force you to look at uncomfortable truths. That changes the way you deal with things.
And the only thing I'd say in my defense is that I'm not a lawyer.
You're a nice guy, so it's okay.
So the report comes out in April 2001, and then that September, 9/11 happens in the United States. And the Bush administration unleashes a war on terror. Can you both speak to how that war on terror then impacts particularly relations between Israel and Palestine and efforts to actually try to reach some sort of reconciliation and a peace agreement?
You know, I was back in the private sector at that point, but I did try to stay in touch with my former business partner, Rich Armitage, on this and other issues, and what I was learning was that the new Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, who was elected in February of 2001 by a landslide, was managing to persuade President Bush that the Palestinians, that particularly the PLO under Yasser Arafat, was part of the international terrorist problem that Bush had pledged to neutralize via a war on terror. So that was a big impact. I must say, though, that in one respect, when Ariel Sharon came to power, the government of Israel had decided rather early in the process not to deal with the fact-finding committee on an official basis. It has to do with a little operation I pulled off that got our team up onto the Haram al-Sharif without being escorted by Israeli police. They didn't like that, so they said, we're not going to deal with the fact-finding committee, and they blamed the chief of staff at the time, Ambassador Larry Pope, who was actually back in New York City consulting with Senator Mitchell. And I went to the Israelis and I said, no need to blame Larry Pope. This was my operation. You want to blame anybody, blame me. But they chose to blame Larry, so he resigned. I became chief of staff. When Sharon took over, he called in our ambassador at the time, Martin Indyk. And Martin asked about the fact-finding committee, and Sharon said, look, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. But this isn't a banana republic. We agreed to cooperate with it up front. We'll cooperate. And the guy I've recruited to be foreign minister, Shimon Peres, is going to be the person who's in charge. So that's when we started to get some active cooperation from the government of Israel. But during the time you're talking about, after 9/11, the United States, particularly President Bush, was persuaded that Arafat was part of the international terror problem.
What I said earlier about the importance of framing, I think was most vividly on display after 9/11. At the end of the day, 9/11, obviously, paradigm-changing, tragic, criminal act, yet it actually had nothing to do with the reality among the Palestinians and the Israelis. This was a terrorist organization based in Afghanistan with an ideology that found its roots in the Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. So yet, once the framing shifted, the American approach totally shifted. During previous administrations, whether it is H.W. Bush, whether it is Clinton, the approach to this conflict was an approach like any other conflict, diplomatically led, and understood that terror is one of the kind of spoilers that you have to deal with it. It was a factor among many other factors, but what the primacy was on the diplomatic. After the war on terror, the lenses completely changed in Washington, and everything was seen through that particular lens, and you could not really get a word in with any American official at that point without framing it within the kind of war on terror framing. By the way, footnote, very much like today, you can't get a word with the administration if you don't frame it with the great power competition, Russia, China. But these are ways that American diplomacy often operates. And I have to say, Sharon very quickly understood the change in this, and Sharon very much, as you said, presented himself as a partner. On our side, we did not understand the gravity of the moment. And I actually remember internal discussions we had on the Palestinian team, in which some of us were saying, look, those of us who were more, had more traffic to Washington, understood more the American mentality, this is a time where we have to take a very strong position against violence and against terror. This is no longer the 80s or the 90s. Things have changed. I think for Arafat, he never really made that shift in his mind. And a failure to kind of understand the moment and to take a clear position on terror, failure to actually demonstrate that he was confronting the Hamas terror at that time before Fatah got involved, that in itself helped push the idea that the Palestinian issue was part of the war on terror. But when we started to talk about the war on terror, there was simply no space for talking about diplomacy. If you don't present it within that framework, then there was no audience to be heard in Washington.
So, just cognizant on time, I'm going to fast forward to the present day. And in the talking about framing, we still have a foreign policy that is very much cognizant about war on terror. So I think that's very, very true in the United States. But then you also point out there's the great power competition with Russia and China. And U.S. power is has diminished vis-a-vis, I think, all the other emerging powers. And we're seeing Biden and Anthony Blinken doing shuttle diplomacy and trying to find a way out of the current hostilities. Is there a way out?
Is there a way out? Look, I mean, maybe again, to take a step back to what you said, I think this administration came with the idea that you can leave the Middle East, you can basically pivot away, great power competition. You know, it started in Obama's days. We're talking about pivot to Asia, all that kind of stuff. And to my mind, you know, the world is a complex place. And if you have a one-dimensional foreign policy, you will always be surprised and you'll always be dragged into it. And so for an administration that has really deprioritized the Middle East, to my mind, it's actually fascinating that this is the only topic that the administration can deal with right now in foreign policy. No one talks about Ukraine anymore. And it's not only Biden and Blinken, you know, Austin is there all the time. Bill Burns is now CIA director, is now on the ground. This is a function of you leave something like this to fester, then ultimately it will come back to bite you. And when you have not been involved, when you have basically checked out, you have lost the tools to impact and to shape the outcome of a certain process. I mean, had the U.S. been more involved, had the U.S. had more assets, more relationships, the U.S. would have been more capable of actually building the diplomatic space that we need, the diplomatic process we need to get out of this. And this is not only vis-a-vis the Palestinians and the Israelis. At the end of the day, getting out of the current tragedy would require a more regional approach, but when you have a time where the region doesn't trust the United States, when the region is convinced that Biden just doesn't care, when his relation with the biggest country, the strongest country, Saudi Arabia, has been so fraught since the very beginning, our ability to shape what's going to come out becomes lower. And let me start, you know, so that's kind of one angle. Another angle, which I think we are still grappling with, is an angle of framing. I mean, look, I certainly, personally, I see what happened on October 7th as, you know, pure, unadulterated terror. You don't go and kill 1,400 civilians in their homes intentionally and call it anything but terror. And that, I think, is something, but yet, it's also, we need to understand that to get out of this conflict, we have to zoom out and look at some of the other dynamics that shaped the moment of October 7th. Why is Hamas popular? Many of the reasons why Hamas was popular as a power was the fact that there was no hope for a diplomatic solution, and as such, Hamas's message of terror becomes one that is more appealing. You know, during the good days of the 1990s when the peace process was working, Hamas's popularity was extremely, extremely low. Hamas has not changed, yet the lack of hope that we see on the Palestinian side made it more popular. We also have to look at, frankly, the poor performance of the Palestinian Authority, an authority that is riddled with corruption, with a leadership that is undemocratic, etc., makes it more appealing for Palestinians to go for an organization like Hamas. So unless we look at all of these issues, unless we fashion our view of how do you exit this in a way that takes account of all of this, unless you start rehabilitating the idea that diplomacy pays, unless you start rehabilitating, reforming the Palestinian Authority to make it something that Palestinians can respect, and today they don't, we might end up with a military end to this round, but I don't think that we will shift the paradigm enough to move forward, nor do I believe would something that will only focus on ending the hostilities in Gaza be attractive enough for the region to get involved in the day after. Now,
well, I want to pick up on that because I think there's a third element that, in terms of the framing, is there was also the Abraham Accords. And you had a number of Arab countries normalize relations with Israel, and then there was talk this summer, certainly, and it seemed that Saudi Arabia and Israel were going to normalize relations. And I think, as a student of foreign policy, it's just like how different times were. I mean, I remember in the 1970s when,
the oil embargo. Yeah.
I mean, the oil embargo was all about, we're going to stand up for the Palestinian rights. I mean, that played I mean, posing it to both of you, what was the role of kind of the Arab world and their movement towards Israel?
I mean, I think, again, let me be very clear. Again, and I'm going to repeat myself because I think it's worth repeating. I don't think that Hamas needs a reason to commit terror. This is what they believe in, and this is what they have been doing since the very beginning. So, I mean, I wouldn't, so to be very clear, because I don't want to come across as justifying what Hamas was doing. Yet, the fact is, the Palestinian issue has become so marginal in U.S. policy, marginal in Arab policy, marginal in the Israeli discourse. I mean, if you look at the Israeli elections, and they've had quite a few of them in the last years, it's a very unstable political system there. The Palestinian issue did not figure. And if you ignore something like this, if you let it fester, then don't be surprised that the ones who will take advantage of this vacuum are the worst actors. In this particular case, it was Hamas that was the worst actor. So all of this, I think, was part of it. Now, was Hamas intent on undermining the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement? I simply don't know. I don't think necessarily they think in such geostrategic terms, where the Iranians involved, and that was part of their calculus. I simply do not know. Now, just one word before I conclude is, while I have been talking about the need for a diplomatic outcome and a day after, and I'm sure we can talk more about it, I also believe that an organization like Hamas, having done what it did, cannot simply, come out and say, look, we did that, and now let's bygones be bygones. In the same way that when Al-Qaeda did what it did in 9/11, I think it was only right that Al-Qaeda gets targeted. The challenge, though, is how do you actually punish Hamas and punish it in a very meaningful way and degrade its capabilities with a minimal civilian casualties and impact on civilian life. And I think this is exactly what that's the challenge that we are seeing right now. But I am very clear that no matter what you have in the end, it needs to be something that ensures that Hamas is no longer stands as a functioning address, but at the same time, create a framework to enable the more constructive voices to actually emerge within the Palestinian arena.
Yeah, none of this is easy, because what we saw happen on October 7th is the result in the recent past. Not only of Hamas's preferred mode of operation, but a deliberate policy, a deliberate strategy on the part of Israel to try to have a live and let live relationship with Hamas, one in which Hamas was basically being paid money by Qatar to involve itself in something resembling local governance. And the Israeli governments of mainly Bibi Netanyahu have used that relationship to go full speed with settlement expansion on the West Bank. So now there's a lot of talk about, oh, well, how about the day after? Can we get the Palestinian Authority involved in Gaza? Where the Palestinian Authority, in the eyes of, I would say, in the eyes of most Palestinians, is some combination of incompetence, corruption, and collaboration. So how in the world is this supposed to work? As a former American diplomat, what I look at a lot is what role, if any, can American diplomacy play in all of this? I know the concern of President Biden and Anthony Blinken and the Secretary of Defense and everybody else is that American diplomacy is utterly at the mercy of how Israel is waging this war in the Gaza Strip. Now, American diplomats have tried. President Biden has tried to do something about this. you know, if I had been in government and I had been sent to Israel to speak with Bibi Netanyahu, who I got to know quite well during my Syria-Israel back channel mediation, and the commanders of the IDF, my recommendation at the outset on October 8th, October 9th would be, go ahead, do your planning, do whatever mobilization you think is prudent, but wait. Wait. Don't be in any hurry to change the subject from what happened on October 7th to something else. But I think what we're dealing with here is an Israeli policy, a way of waging war in the Gaza Strip that is not in the interests of Israel. Okay? There are much more critical things you can say about the way war is being waged in the Gaza Strip, but it's not in the interest of Israel. Israel is finding itself isolated in the region. The Saudis, who supposedly were on the verge of, perhaps before too long, normalizing with Israel, the Saudis are now begging Israel, stop, agree to a ceasefire. And it just strikes me, and here I'll put on my military hat, as a former military officer, Israel is forgetting something very, very, very fundamental in what's referred to as a war amongst the people. And that is, the people are the objective. You're not going to have sustained security for Israel unless somehow Palestinian people are a major part of the equation. I'm not gonna sit here and allege war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide. I just don't think Israel is waging this conflict properly.
Okay, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to open it up to questions.
Just a couple of quick reactions. One of the challenges of being an analyst and a diplomat is you look at issues like war and actually as diplomacy purely from, we're trained to look at it purely from kind of a rational point of view. And I think though, many of foreign policy acts and many wars are actually a result of also political and emotional moments. And I actually here would be more charitable to the administration. I would argue that, I've been in contact with Israelis from October 7th onwards. The mood in Israel is such that I can't imagine an Israeli government not acting, and I sympathize. At the end of the day, I repeat, the terror that we saw on October 7th is something that no nation, especially a small nation like Israel, can withstand without reaction, and I think that's a moment where cool heads could not have prevailed. By the way, in the same way that today, if you talk to Palestinians seeing the images coming out of Gaza, this is not a time where rationality plays a role. I actually think the administration, I want to be more charitable than you, Fred. I think they understood that at that moment, things on the ground will take their course, in the same way that when we were working in the intifada, at a certain moment, the level of violence is such that it has to burn itself out. And I believe they've been actually doing, I don't say maybe a good job, but certainly doing their best to deal with the humanitarian issues. There would have been no access to humanitarian goods without that for the administration. And I think right now, when you understand there's nothing you can do about the short term, you start planning for the long term. And I think this is where much of the thinking right now in the administration is, and they're waiting for a moment where they feel they can have more impact. But I tend to be more charitable, because at the end of the day, when something that is so emotive and emotional, external actors can only do so much to impact the internal dynamics.
Yeah, I tend to be less charitable, both toward the administration and the way Israel processed some of the initial decisions here. This is precisely the time when cool heads have to prevail. They must. This is what leadership is all about. I think one of the problems in the Israeli context is that the current prime minister
Is not a leader.
well, he's not a leader, and I think the way he processed things was that, an immediate strike back. Let the bombs fly. This is something that has to be done, if for no other reason than to save me politically. Okay, and I'm just afraid. I don't want to be unnecessarily uncharitable to anybody. But as I look at the chain of decisions that seem to have been made in Israel, it's hard for me not to conclude that Bibi Netanyahu's political status, his desire to be basically prime minister for life, and the fact that Israelis widely across the board, unbelievable percentages, blame him for Israel's lack of preparedness on October 7th.
Well, that's why we probably need feminist foreign policy. I will open it up to questions. If you can pose a question, I will cut you off if you are going on and making a long statement. The floor is yours. Yes.
Hi, should I use the mic or should I just say it?
Can everybody hear her?
Sorry.
Can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Try mic?
Take a
Okay.
mic.
Thank you. So Israel has used copious amounts of white phosphorus throughout the Gaza Strip in what has been recognized by several human rights organizations as a war crime. So I'm wondering if you support the use of white phosphorus on civilians in Gaza.
As a former artilleryman who is quite familiar with white phosphorus, I absolutely oppose its use anywhere near a civilian population.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Can you comment on your analysis of the Israeli administration and how the far right end of Bibi's cabinet is pushing him further and further along the line to create the havoc that's currently going on. They speak openly about their disregard for the Palestinian population and the right for the right of the settlements to exist in Judea and Samaria. They don't even talk about the West Bank.
You know, I'm going to be less charitable now, since we talk about this. And I would say, actually, at the end of the day, Bibi, that's Benjamin Netanyahu, is the prime minister. He's the one who brought him into his coalition. So, at the end of the day, the buck stops there, not with them. Look, I mean, I think this previous government, the current government, is one that is guilty of so many different issues, and I would focus actually here not on what's happening in Gaza, because I think the military response, my read of the Israeli polity right now, is the military response that Israel is doing in Gaza is one that is supported, I think, wall to wall. The majority of Israelis, I would very strongly recommend actually a thread by a guy called Amir Tibon, who is a reporter for Haaretz, which is a very left-wing newspaper, who basically is saying, we have to respond militarily. Maybe more care to civilians, etc., but respond militarily. I think the real risk that I see from these very extremist elements is not actually in Gaza right now. I see it in the West Bank. I see that they're using basically all attention right now is on Gaza, and they're trying to push policies in the West Bank that are very damaging. And that I would say three sets of policy they're trying to push. One is use this to basically expedite the settlement construction. And actually, interestingly, because one of them is the finance minister and has been trying to funnel money in that direction. So that's something to keep a close eye on. But the second thing, which is something that preceded the war in Gaza but has really increased in recent weeks, is the settler violence. Now, you know, I am against settlements as a political matter. Yet, there is a group of settlers who distinctly are actually very violent and have been using violence. And this has been the case for a long time. It has really intensified since this government took over, and really intensified since the war. The last stats I saw, which were just a few days ago, UN stats, 8 Palestinians were killed by settlers. And you have members of this cabinet who are actually basically saying, it's okay. They're giving the kind of top legitimacy, top cover for some of this. So much so that this has become, I think, one of the major areas of concern for this administration and for the Israeli security sector. When you have the head of the Israeli Shin Bet, which is their counter-terror, basically their FBI, going to the prime minister and saying settler violence could trigger a security breakdown in the West Bank. So that's the second thing that I'm worried about. The third thing that I'm worried about is that they're actually also trying to use this to basically collapse the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is problematic, and we've both mentioned why it's problematic, yet at the end of the day, it is an actor, an address that still believes in diplomacy, not in violence. And some of these members see this Palestinian Authority as basically a liability towards Israel because they don't want to see a two-state solution and diplomacy. So again, the same Minister of Finance, Smotrich, decides I'm not going to transfer money that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinians, I'm not going to transfer it to the Palestinian Authority. Luckily, in this particular case, the defense minister overruled him and the money will be transferred. But these are 3 sets of policies that could ignite security and political breakdown in the West Bank, which will not only complicate the security landscape, but will also make a future diplomatic process impossible, and could risk spillover into Jordan and other areas.
Yes.
So my question is, given that Gaza remains under a full electricity blackout since the 11th of October, which was a result of Israel halting its power and fuel supply, which triggered the shutdown of Gaza's sole power plant, and given that the entry of fuel remains banned by Israeli authorities, who also determine what can and cannot enter Gaza through the Rafah crossing in Egypt. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and over 1,000 law professors from U.S. law schools have asserted that Israel's cutting off of electricity to the 2.2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip constitutes collective punishment and is therefore a violation of international law. So I know that you said that you consider Israel's response to the humanitarian crisis somewhat generous. And I'm curious if you support Israel cutting off electricity to the 2.2 million. Oh, you don't. Sorry, I misunderstood.
I didn't say that.
Oh, sorry. You said something about the humanitarian crisis and.
I'm saying that the administration has been pushing to improve. The administration has been pushing to improve humanitarian access, and were it not for the efforts of the administration, humanitarian access would have been much lower than we have now.
Thank you. Well, the question is, do you support Israel's cutting off of electricity to the 2.2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip?
You want to take this?
Yeah, I personally do not support it, okay? But I try to look at this, from the point of view of someone who has some experience in warfare. For the Israelis to prevail at the end of the day, they simply must understand that the part they have to win is the Palestinian people. And this is God knows I don't have any quick answers to this. How does all of this get unscrewed given what's happened? I don't have any flip answers or any quick answers. But something I think is worth thinking about. Is Israel capable of doing this? Okay? If Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin were to go in and have a chat with Bibi Netanyahu and the commander of the IDF and say something close to what I just said, how would it be received? I mean, my sense, I mean, you talk about, you know, electricity and fuel and all of this. My sense is that Israel could, in the fullness of time, kill every single Hamas operative and leader who was involved on October 7th and still not achieve a military victory, okay? Because what comes next? If the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip have simply become convinced that Israel is an enemy, period, nothing is ever going to change, there is no prospect for any kind of a negotiated settlement. What then arises in the Gaza Strip? Okay. But and I think this is a question Israelis need to ask themselves. I mean, it's, you know, it's warfare 101 in the modern age. It's the people you need to win if you're going to end up with anything resembling stability and security.
You know, I mean, I see it as a very complex situation, because you actually have at least three different elements that you need that need to be balanced in this. One element is actually, as I said it before, and I continue saying it, I think degrading Hamas's capabilities and ensuring that Hamas is unable to do something like this ever again in the future is a very legitimate political and military objective. Yet, as Fred just said, as you win the battle, you want to make sure that you don't lose the war. And this is part of the thinking. And another part of it is that no matter what your military objective is, there are standards of international law that need to be respected. Understanding that international law actually does not pretend that it aims to eliminate civilian casualties, it aims to mitigate civilian casualties. So managing these three different elements is actually a very complex management. What I would say about civilian, whether it's electricity or access to humanitarian issues, is the following. It's not only a moral imperative to think about it, but it's also a diplomatic, realpolitik imperative to think about it. At the end of the day, the U.S. could go and invade Afghanistan, and rightly so, after 9/11, and basically do and have all the time that we needed in the world, because we are a superpower and we are on the Security Council. Israel, at the end of the day, is a country that needs the diplomatic space to be able to achieve its military objective vis-a-vis Hamas. And without demonstrating that it's paying enough attention to the issue of protecting civilians, then this kind of support will disappear. I have to say, I've been surprised, for example, that this is not the first war. This is very different from previous wars. By this time, in previous wars, Europe would have peeled away from supporting the U.S. On this one. This time, because of, again, what happened in October 7th, Europe still is very much behind the U.S. But if the U.S. cannot convince the Europeans that Israel is doing everything possible to minimize civilian casualties and to allow for humanitarian access, then the ability to create this international coalition in support of a legitimate goal will then flip, and the U.S. will find itself isolated in this. And the U.S. can do 3, 4, 5 vetoes. At a certain point, the U.S. will not maintain this space. So both as a moral imperative and also as a practical realpolitik imperative, looking after and taking care of the civilian aspect of things, I think is key, as we also look, as Fred said, on how do you move then afterwards, and how do you create the conditions for a more constructive day after.
If we had a senior IDF officer sitting here tonight, that officer would say, Israel in its targeting makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. We act on the basis of sound intelligence, and we have legal advisors every step of the way. My response to that is that may be true, but just how relevant is it on the ground when you have a densely built-up area like Gaza City, okay? You can have the best intelligence in the world that tells you, you know, there's a squad of 12 Hamas fighters in Building X, all right? Let's take them out. It's a high-value target. International law does not forbid this. International law calls for proportionality. Well, guess what? There's no mathematical formula attached to the concept of proportionality. So you drop a 2,000-pound bomb on the building. Yes, you kill 12 people who richly deserve to be dead. No doubt about that. Richly deserve to be dead. But what about the other 150?
So
What does this do? Even if it's not framed as a moral issue, what does this do to your ability to actually win the war in a political sense?
So what sticks does the United States have to get the Israelis to at least agree to what they're talking about, a humanitarian pause, much less to a ceasefire? Are there any sticks that the Biden administration can use?
Well, the Biden administration may eventually come to the conclusion, and they'll do it quietly at first. They'll do it one-on-one with Bibi Netanyahu. That we need not just a humanitarian pause, but a ceasefire right now. There is nothing in military science that says you have to accomplish your objectives in the next 20 minutes. Okay? It may take some time, and what's happening now, from the point of view of the United States, is just not acceptable.
I'm going to go to the back and then I'll come up here. Yeah.
Thank you. You both seem to share the political objective of what Israel calls destroying Hamas, and you raise a variety of complexities. So far, in terms of proportionality, over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. 4,000 of them are children. Over 25,000 have been injured, and over 1.5 million have been internally displaced. I would like to hear from both of you, what is the death toll at which the political objective of destroying Hamas, of not leaving it an address, as Mr. Ghaith provided, is no longer worth the number of lives that are being destroyed?
I think we're at that point now,
I'd like to hear
and I
from
think
Mr. Ghaith as well.
the United States should press for a ceasefire, and believe me on this. I firmly believe that the perpetrators of October 7th need to be dead. I have no problem with that at all. But I think the civilian toll in Gaza has reached the point where it is, again, put aside for a moment moral issues. If you just want to look at this from a realpolitik point of view, it's counterproductive for the United States, and for that matter, it's counterproductive for Israel.
Look, of course, I'm not going to give you a number, because there is no number that you can put at it, and as Fred just said, there's no mathematical formula there. But I would argue that, to me, the moment where I think it needs to stop is when Hamas realizes that its continued insistence on... you asked me a question, please let me continue. Hamas insists on continuing to fight when a result of the fighting is the Palestinian civilians being killed. That's another consideration to take into account. There are two parties to this war now. One of the parties is Hamas, and I find it, frankly, difficult to argue that we should push one side to stop fighting while the other side should come under no pressure. Frankly, what I would argue is Hamas has regional backers, be it Qatar, be it Turkey, both are U.S. Allies, and I would be pressuring those countries to pressure Hamas to basically say, you know what, we also are going to do what we need to do. But to expect that Hamas can basically wait for Palestinians to be, enough Palestinians to be killed, to basically say, now we can get away with it, I think this is something that is also problematic.
That's almost exactly what I was about to ask, but maybe I could just ask you to spin that out in more detail, because it seems to me that this is what's missing from the equation. The U.S. obviously has no ability to influence Hamas. It has the ability to influence Israel, as we know, through financial leverage and other means. But whether it's Qatar or Turkey or another regional power, perhaps Saudi Arabia doesn't have the direct ties to Hamas that the others do. Perhaps there might be informal diplomatic influence. What I was wondering is if this influence is put on Hamas to release some large number of hostages, perhaps not all of them, perhaps they want to hold some as bargaining chips. That would presumably also put the U.S. in a position where they would be more likely to support a ceasefire, which so far as I understand they do not yet do. Are there any signs that this is underway? We hear periodically about negotiations through Qatar over hostages.
Yeah,
I haven't heard much in the last few days. I'm just curious where it stands.
Mediation continues, and you know, there are reports that we were very close to a deal that would have sprung 50 or more hostages just before the Israeli ground operation in the northern part of the Gaza Strip began. And there was some back and forth between Israel and Qatar about timing and all of that. And it so the deal wasn't made. But my understanding is that there is still something cooking. Now, whether it would result, I have difficulty myself distinguishing between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire. I mean, I've heard people, experts on the radio, say, "Well, a ceasefire is a you know, permanently stops the fighting." No, that would be an armistice, okay. But I think if there is a reasonably large number of hostages being released, if this is close, there would be a fairly significant stopping of hostilities, and the United States would certainly support it, and I think try to build on it.
Look, the U.S. is already engaged in Qatar. I mean, as we speak, Bill Burns is there. Maybe he left already, but he was there yesterday. And so far, our approach with the Qataris, again, understandably, is we're playing nice publicly and trying to put some pressure privately. I do believe, though, that at a certain point, the kid gloves have to go. And a country like Qatar, which is actually very dependent on the U.S. for so many different things, including its own survival, has to also be given a degree of an ultimatum. You know, you either deliver, because you know, the Qataris are saying our relation with Hamas are good because they enable us to impact Hamas. Well, this is the test today. If you can deliver, great. Then you know there's a logic in your hosting and supporting Hamas. But if you're just getting the accolades from it without actually being able to deliver, at a certain point we have to tell you, why are you doing this? You're useless, therefore expel the Hamas leaders from there and stop your support for it. But so far I think it may be premature. I do know there's a lot of behind the scenes, but at a certain point the Qataris need to know that we, in the same way the Israelis need to know that we can move from public to private, so from private to public, we don't want to put pressure. The Qataris need to know that also we are willing to do that. And the Qataris and the Turks have tremendous support on Hamas. You know, the Iranians do, but we don't have access to the Iranians. But these two countries do have that. You know, simply a decision by Qatar to expel Hamas leaders would deal a huge blow to the organization. But so far, my sense is they are not really using that leverage to the maximum.
Yeah, and one of the I understand that one of the practical problems here. I mean, you've got a cadre of Hamas political leaders living in Doha, okay? Then you have the military leaders who are in Gaza. Sometimes I think the Qataris have discovered that there are slightly differing views, okay, between the political people in Qatar and the military people on the ground. There have also been some practical difficulties in arranging secure communications between the Hamas political element in Qatar and the military people on the ground. So it's working, but I'll tell you, anybody who has the experience someday, saying this to Bard students, of getting involved in some of this stuff, some of these details about how do you make things work can be really pretty vexing.
Okay, I'll take a couple more questions. Go ahead, Monica.
Fred, in the past you've spoken about diplomacy as often being a way to find a ladder for somebody to climb back down. And I think that under any circumstances with any prime minister or with any leader, this would be a difficult and challenging situation. But the specific circumstances of Bibi, who had hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets every single weekend until October 7th. And now the majority of the country blames him for this attack. He is like a cornered dog, and it feels like he will be less willing to listen to any reason that he might have ever been willing to listen to than before, that it's his own personal survival. So my question is, what is the ladder? What can the U.S. offer? What would you offer if you were in that position now?
I'm not sure what the ladder is, but what I will say is that the United States Senate has finally confirmed a U.S. ambassador to Israel. Okay, talk about negligent actors in all of this. An ambassador has finally been confirmed, and I think Ambassador Liu is going to take up residence in Bibi Netanyahu's inbox for the next several months. I think of course he's got to. This is one of the things about diplomacy. You've got to somehow try to establish a relationship of trust and confidence with the person you're trying to persuade, and being able to do that on the fly isn't all that easy. But yes, the United States will be looking to construct a ladder so that Bibi Netanyahu can climb down if he wishes to climb down. My fear is that he sees the way things are going in the Gaza war now as being essential to his own political survival. And if that's his conclusion, he won't use a ladder, and any efforts to build one will be basically a waste of time.
Just one maybe addition to what you said is, diplomacy is not a magical solution. If there's one thing that actually this report and the work of the committee shows, that sometimes events on the ground are the ones who dictate the trajectory of things and not necessarily diplomacy. So while yes, diplomacy can be useful, but sometimes events on the ground overtake it. And I personally feel that at this moment we're still at that moment.
Great. We had a question over here.
Yeah. In the very beginning, you emphasized on the importance of framing, and so my question is going to be on the framing of violence and maintaining the safety and security of civilians. You both talked about ending this violence. Right now, we're looking at 14.3 million Palestinian people. 5.6 million of them are refugees, according to the UN, and that have yet to attain their inalienable rights as defined by the General Assembly, namely the right to self-determination without external interference, the right to national independence and sovereignty, the right to return to their homes and property from which they have been displaced. So, that being said, what about the safety and security of Palestinians? What about the expansion of settlements? Does that constitute as violence? What about placing more and more checkpoints? Is that violence? What about settler violence? What about night raids into Palestinian homes? What about detaining children for throwing rocks? And a 17-year-old siege? Do you consider these acts of terror and acts of violence?
I mean, first of all, just as a point of law, General Assembly resolutions are not actually binding. But that said, some of these, no, they're not. Security Council resolutions are. You ask a legal question, I'm giving you a legal answer.
I didn't say laws.
Okay, Okay, so what do you? Some of the mentions that you mentioned are violence. Some are not violence. Things don't have to be violence to be actually unacceptable or under international law illegal. So I would say that our settlements are illegal under international law, but they're not violence. You know, I'm uncomfortable with taking terms and interpreting them too widely. I believe that violence is when you actually, you know, so by international law, is when you actually do violence, bodily harm to or killing of people. It doesn't mean that other things are not legally problematic. So I would say yes, settlements are legally problematic. I would say the issue of self-determination is much more complex because there were actually negotiations in the past, and the negotiations failed, and the negotiations failed because of mistakes from both sides. Actually, from three sides. The U.S. has its own part of it. I would argue that the issue of the right of return, for example, is not a right as understood by in international terms. This is an aspirational thing based on a UN General Assembly resolution. So we're conflating too many things in one issue. What I would argue is that each of these issues have to be dealt with in its own right and its own merit, and use the right tools to approach it. To me, when I see terrorism, I see that you use legitimate force to deal with terrorism. When you see a diplomatic problem, like settlements, you use diplomatic tools to deal with it. When you find something like self-determination, which is much more complex, then you go through diplomacy and negotiation to reach it. So I think each of these issues has its own approach, and conflating one and the other actually doesn't help us resolve the problem.
Go back there.
Yeah, so just to follow up on this question of framing, I think that there seems to be a maybe some kind of distinction that I'd like to better understand. So from a diplomatic point of view, my understanding is that you're not speaking from a military point of view, or at least you're not military officials. So what makes the framing of issues of self-determination, for instance, less or more biased, if you will, than terms like legitimate force or those who richly deserve to be dead? I think in the instance of 10,000 people having just been killed, I think perhaps who richly deserves to be living might be a better frame for diplomatic interests.
Yeah, and this is why I personally favor a ceasefire now. I think the civilian casualties are simply too high, and it appears that they're going to be getting much higher. In terms of the people who perpetrated what happened on October 7th, I'm sorry, you and I have a different point of view, and I have no apology for what I said.
I'll take one last question before we wrap up. Yes, in the corner.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I wrote this down. Do you think we'll see another Israeli election soon? And if so, do you foresee the Likud party losing power?
I cannot think of any scenario where such a major military and intelligence failure takes place in which the government that was in charge will survive politically intact. I just simply do not see it, and I think you mentioned it, Fred. This is not like, you know, we're coming to a very popular Israeli government and this something happened. It's already very, very contentious, etc. To me, it's just impossible. But, you know, but this is actually, to me, raises a different question. Because look, one thing that we've seen in Israel, I would say really since the second intifada, maybe since Ehud Olmert was prime minister, is for many Israelis, the Palestinian issue has become irrelevant. The only Israelis over the last decades who were actually paying attention were either security forces because it's their job, or the settlers because they have a mission. And if you're an Israeli, you know, middle class, whatever, high-tech person, for you it's like happening in a different universe. This is impossible. It's impossible to see that after this, that this will remain the case. Now, in which direction, it's impossible to predict. You know, we had two actually precedents in the past. We had the first intifada that led Israel to basically say we need to find a solution. We had the second intifada that led Israel to say there is no solution. So which way it's gonna go, there's way too many moving pieces in it. The one thing that I can say with any degree of certainty is, once this is over, I'm willing to bet good money that the current government will just not be in place.
Yeah, and I don't want to close this session with a real downer, but having spent a lot of quality time dealing with Bibi Netanyahu, notwithstanding the current state he finds himself in with Israeli public opinion polls, I would have to say, don't count him out. Don't count him out. He can make a comeback. I would close by thanking all of you for coming, and I think it would be interesting, even though at this point it's almost ancient history, but take a look at the Sharm el-Sheikh fact-finding committee report and think in terms of how the findings and recommendations might just have some applicability to the horrible situation we find ourselves in now.
Well, Ghaith and Fred, thank you very much.
Thank you.